the Black Death. That word was in late medieval Europe the synonym for mass dying of people, and indescribably cruel suffering. This pandemic was caused by a highly contagious and infectious bacterium released. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, also known as Yersinia pestis orientalis, or Yersinia pestis medievalis. This bacterium is a very adaptable and available in many different variants occurring pathogen. But in history, people became not only infected by the plague in the Middle Ages. The plague runs like a red thread through the whole history of mankind. With the plague, the lymph glands become inflamed. This happens due to the high concentration of bacteria in the blood. The incubation time is 1 to 3 days. The question arises, why a third of the population catch the plague and die en masse in late medieval Europe? And the second question that needs to be answered, why do people have been able to defeat this disease only in the modern age? The most common diseases were bubonic plague and pneumonic plague. The blood poisoning effect is triggered when the bacteria complete their normal life cycle and die. Large amounts of toxic secretions are released directly into the bloodstream. Kidneys and liver can fail when trying to cleanse the system of toxins. In the end, the victim succumbs to toxic shock. In this video, I tell you the story about one of the worst and most devastating diseases ever existed in human history. Here we go. The dreadful disease of the plague has struck in the last 2,000 years, cost the lives of around 100 million people. This is how the symptoms of the Black Death were described by the doctors of the Middle Ages. The patient's eyes began to shine unnaturally and water. Breathing became heavier, and a slight whistling sound was heard when exhaling. There was severe pain in the neck and under the armpits. As a result, the face has become very pale. Stains on the neck and armpits have been growing by the hour. They turned into inflamed bumps. The bumps were cut open by the doctors, and one as from these fluid ran out, which was a mixture of pus and blood. In addition, black spots have formed on the abdomen and legs. The plague bumps on the body became more and more. The human has rotted in a living state, and is after died within 3 days. The plague epidemics already have mankind to a large extent shaken in the 4th century BC. The first major plague epidemic was recorded in ancient Egypt. Since then, the disease has been at an interval of 10 to 15 years, again and again in one, and in another area erupted around the globe. In the year 540 AD, the plague broke out in the African region of Ethiopia. After a few years, the disease reached Constantinople via trade routes, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The peak of the plague epidemic in Justinian Roman times occurred in 544 AD. By this time, several thousand people were dying every day in the capital of Byzantium. The disease migrated from Constantinople to Italy. The plague raged in Italy well into the year 560 AD. Other European states of the 6th century were not spared, and were also struck by the plague. The epidemic was defeated for a few years, before erupting again in 557 AD and 570 AD. This procedure continued for about the next 200 years. In 639 AD, a great drought hit the Middle East. Famines were spreading among the population, and it was time also takes out the terrible plague. The eruption at that time occurred not far from the city of Jerusalem. The plague then spread to the countries of Syria and all of Palestine. The disease doesn't distinguish poor from rich, or whether someone is farmer, or distinguish between priest or king, and ate its way through the towns and villages like a predator. In 1342 AD, there was an outbreak of plague on a large-scale pandemic. The disease was also called the Black Death by contemporary witnesses of this era. The origin of this plague pathogen was on the western border of the Chinese Empire. And after 6 months the plague reached Asia Minor and today's Turkey. The plague swept through every town and village like a storm, leaving only mountains of corpses behind. Here too, the plague was transmitted by the incised fleas, which were carried by the rat jumped on man. In 1348 AD, about half the population of the Middle East and North Africa died. Some towns and villages were ghost towns, because all the inhabitants died. The epidemic spread further to late medieval Egypt. The plague was even worse there. In Egypt alone several thousand people died every day. The piles of corpses grew so large, that people dug large mass graves. Further over the ports of Alexandria and Constantinople, the disease was on merchant ships, and went further to Europe. These merchant ships carried the rats as stowaways, which became infected with the plague bacterium. Even if the merchant ship was anchored in Venice, for example, and the crew was not infected, because of possible plague infection allowed to land, the ship rats nevertheless managed to reach land via the ship's ropes. The plague fleas on the rats have been transferred to the rats of the respective European city, and thus carried death further inland. In 1347 AD, all of Italy was in a deadly stranglehold by the plague. People just died on the streets, and it was sometimes difficult to get through the streets. The doctors wore full-length coats for a long time. The faces were covered with masks that had a bird's beak. Hands became gloved, and the death toll increased exponentially. In 6 months, 50% of the population of Florence died. Whole houses stood empty without a single occupant. Nobody took the goods and valuables, even the thieves were afraid of getting infected. The doctors also died with the plague patients, although they observed all the precautionary measures. The epidemic has migrated from Italy to France. In the southern city of Marseille, 60,000 people have died in 2 months. The plague catastrophe caused a pause in the 100 Years' War between England and France. But more lives have been taken by the plague than the 100 Years' War itself. By the end of 1348 AD, the plague had completely infected Germany and Austria. In these countries, 30% of the population died from the plague. The churches and cemeteries were closed, because they could not accommodate any more deceased. Several thousand people died every day. The bodies were placed on wagons, and buried in mass graves outside the city. There was no more room in the individual cities. In 1349 AD, it was the turn of the British Isles. In London alone, 50% of the population died from the plague. The plague continued to migrate like a hungry predator to Scandinavia. At this time, the Scandinavian countries were experiencing a mass extinction like never before. The cardinals and bishops interpreted the 14th century plague pandemic as a punishment of God for the sins committed by men. As a result, forgiveness of sins was prayed for in all churches and cathedrals. This went so far that ordinary people walked the streets barefoot, and whipped themselves to the point of blood, and carried crosses like Jesus of Nazareth, on the way to his crucifixion. In this way, ordinary people across Europe hoped to free themselves from their sins. In addition, they sprinkled ashes over their heads. Disabled and chronically ill people were accused of other diseases as the cause of the plague. These were chased away, given no food, and some killed. In addition, Jews were accused of causing the plague. This led to pogroms, in which people of the Jewish faith were persecuted. From 1352 AD, the plague infections went down. From 1353 AD was the end of the Great Plague Pandemic, the Black Death. This pandemic claimed the lives of 25 million Europeans. The plague raged in Europe sporadically, and at irregular intervals up to the 18th century. The last major outbreak of the plague occurred in Manchuria in 1910 AD, and in the southern and western provinces of China. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up. See you soon. Your channel History Best.